What if the greatest danger in your town wasn't an army, but a cough you couldn't see or explain? That was medieval life during pandemics. No medicine, no answers, only prayers, rumors, and fear as people collapsed within days. When we talk about pandemics in the Middle Ages, plague dominates the story, especially the Justinianic Plague and the Black Death. But medieval disease history was broader, deadlier, and more complex than one outbreak. Today, ancient DNA and archaeology have replaced myth with evidence, revealing a past that's even more unsettling than we imagined. The tiny bacterium with a talent for chaos. The star of this nightmare is Yersinia pestis, the bacterium that causes plague. In the medieval world, it could show up in multiple forms. Most famously, bubonic plague, wool imphodes, boos, but also pneumonic plague, infection, that can spread via droplets, and septicemic plague, fection. Modern public health sources still describe these forms and emphasize that plague remains treatable today if caught early, meaning the medieval death toll wasn't inevitable because plague, but because plague met a world without modern medicine. Also, quick mythbuster, the creepy beaked plague doctor outfit you've seen in pictures is not a Black Death 14th century thing. That costume becomes documented later, early Roderney, even though it's become the mascot of medieval doom in pop culture. The Justinianic Plague and the argument historians are still having. Let's go back to the 6th century. The pandemic, often called the Plague of Justinian, is associated with the reign of Justinian I and outbreaks beginning around 541 CE. Traditional narratives long described it as a civilization-shaking catastrophe across the Mediterranean world. But modern scholarship has been debating the scale. Some researchers argue we've exaggerated mortality because the written sources are dramatic and the hard demographic evidence is patchy. Others argue the impact was real but uneven, devastating in some places, less obvious in others. What's changed recently is that the debate isn't just texts versus skepticism anymore. It's also genomes. Studies have recovered why. Pestis DNA from human remains linked to the first pandemic, providing direct biological confirmation in regions tied to the outbreak story. And then there's the kind of discovery that makes historians sit up straight, evidence for a mass mortality event associated with the first pandemic at Jerash, including biomolecular confirmation and archaeological signals consistent with catastrophic burial. That matters because one of the big questions has always been, where is the physical footprint? Finds like this push the discussion forward from maybe to here, our bodies, dates, and pathogen DNA. So was the Justinianic Plague the end of the world? The honest updated answer is, it depends where you look, and the evidence is getting sharper, enough that extreme denial, nothing happened, is getting harder to defend, while extreme certainty about uniform, empire-wide collapse also looks too simple. The Black Death, when the medieval world hit a wall at full speed. If the first pandemic is debated, the Black Death is the medieval event that punches history in the face and leaves a handprint. The rough scale is still argued in detail, but mainstream estimates commonly describe tens of millions dead and an enormous share of Europe's population lost in the mid-14th century. Encyclopaedia Britannica, for example, gives an estimate around 25 million deaths in Europe, 1347. 1351. And yes, historians still fight about exact percentages because medieval census data is, let's call it, emotionally confident, but statistically chaotic. But the consensus remains that it was among the most lethal pandemics in recorded history. Where did it start? For a long time, the Black Death's origin story had a lot of arrows on maps and a lot of probably. Then, DNA science showed up like a detective with receipts. A major breakthrough came from research on burials near Lake Issyk-Kul in modern Kyrgyzstan, where tombstones dated to 1338-1339 mention pestilence. Researchers recovered Y. pestis genomes and showed they sit close to the ancestral branch leading to the Black Death pandemic lineage, supporting a Central Asian origin in or near the Tian Shan region. That doesn't mean one village caused Europe. It means plague ecology, reservoirs, fleas, climate, trade routes likely created the conditions for a jump that then traveled astonishing distances through connected networks, trade, ports, caravans, until it hit crowded medieval cities that were basically perfect disease accelerators. Trade routes, ports, and the medieval version of too much traveling. Medieval Europe didn't have airports, but it had something almost as effective for disease: busy trade routes connecting distant regions. Plague could move with goods, animals, and people. Once it reached port cities, it didn't need magic to go inland. Just commerce and humans doing normal human things like visiting family and selling products, which sadly are not listed as anti-plague measures. Also, plague wasn't just one clean wave that arrived, bowed, and left. The Black Death period is better understood as an initial catastrophic outbreak followed by recurrences across regions for centuries. That long tail is part of why it reshaped economies and institutions. It wasn't a one-time tragedy, it was a repeating trauma. What did it do to society? When a society loses a huge share of its workforce quickly, the economy doesn't politely continue. It panics. In many places, labor became scarce, and survivors could demand better terms, sometimes higher wages, sometimes more mobility, sometimes simply the audacity to say no to awful deals. Economic history work notes substantial wage increases in post-plague England in the decades after the initial outbreak, reflecting the shock to labor supply and bargaining power. But it wasn't a universal everyone-got-rich fairy tale. Outcomes varied by region, institution, and how elites responded. Some places tightened controls, some saw long-run structural shifts. Modern research continues to refine these patterns with better datasets and methods, including studies of labor relations and wage structures that treat medieval pay records like a spreadsheet of human bargaining. Socially, pandemics also amplify blame. Minority groups, outsiders, and the wrong neighbors have historically been targeted during disease fear. Medieval Europe was no exception. When people don't understand transmission, they invent explanations, and those explanations often turn into violence, scapegoating, and policy driven by panic rather than facts. Quarantine was invented because desperation is a great teacher. Here's the darkly impressive part. Even without germ theory, medieval and early modern cities developed practices that resemble public health, because repeated disaster forces innovation. Quarantine practices emerged in port contexts where authorities tried to slow introduction of disease by restricting movement and waiting out illness. They didn't know bacteria, they did know patterns: ships arrive, people die, therefore ships must be suspicious. Not a perfect theory, but honestly, not the worst logic for the 1300s. The key takeaway isn't they were clueless, it's they were learning from observation, just without microscopes. And when you read medieval reactions with that lens, you start seeing a society improvising risk management in real time. The Middle Ages and late medieval Europe had other epidemic mysteries. Plague dominated, but it wasn't alone. Later outbreaks like the sweating sickness, late 15th, 16th centuries, show how many epidemic events remain medically unresolved. Modern summaries still describe it as a recurring, fast, terrifying illness of unknown cause, notorious for sudden onset and rapid death. The point: pandemic history isn't one neat storyline. It's a messy archive of biological events, some well identified, some still debated, all filtered through limited records and human fear. We're not just reading about pandemics, we're sequencing them. Ancient DNA has transformed medieval pandemics from historical mystery into testable science. Researchers can now extract pathogen genomes from human remains, trace how strains evolved, and confirm origins like the Central Asian source of the Black Death. The same methods are clarifying the first plague pandemic, though scientists stress that conclusions depend on where evidence survives and where researchers look. In short, the medieval pandemic story is still evolving, driven by data, not drama. Plague also hasn't disappeared. The World Health Organization confirms that human cases still occur today, mainly in parts of Africa such as Madagascar and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The difference now is treatment, antibiotics, surveillance, and rapid response can control outbreaks. Medieval societies had none of this, only fear, prayer, and improvised rules made up after loss had already struck. If history has taught us anything, it's that pandemics don't just belong to the past, they shape the future too. Understanding how medieval societies faced invisible enemies helps us make sense of the world we live in today. If you found this deep dive insightful, make sure to like and subscribe.